There is a moment, and perhaps you know it intimately, when everything you built, everything you trusted, everything you believed yourself to be, simply stops holding. Not gradually, not with warning, it stops. The career you sacrificed a decade for, the relationship that was supposed to last, the version of yourself you presented to the world with such careful, exhausting precision. One morning, or one season, or one shattering conversation, and all of it becomes rubble at your feet. And the cruelest part is not the loss itself. The cruelest part is the silence that follows. The way the world keeps moving while you stand perfectly still in the wreckage of something you can't yet name. Most people will tell you to heal faster, to find the lesson, to move on. They will hand you their timelines and their formulas and their cheerful assurances that everything happens for a reason. Carl Jung would have said something far more unsettling and far more true. He would have said, what is happening to you is not happening to you by accident, not because some benevolent force arranged your pain, not because you deserved it, but because the deepest intelligence in the human psyche, what Jung called the self, does not issue invitations, it does not suggest, it does not wait politely for a convenient moment. It breaks what must be broken, it dissolves what has outlived its purpose. It tears open the very walls you built so carefully, because those walls had become a prison, and you had been living inside them for so long you had mistaken them for home. If you are watching this video, something in you already suspects this. Something in you already senses. Beneath the grief, beneath the confusion, beneath the exhaustion, that what you are moving through is not random destruction. It is initiation, and this channel exists for exactly that kind of person. The one who is awake enough to feel it, but not yet clear enough to understand it. If this is you, stay with us. And if what you find here speaks to something real inside you, consider subscribing. This work is ongoing, and so is yours. Jung spent his life refusing the comfortable lie. He watched human beings suffer, in his consulting room, in his own psyche, in the long, brutal corridors of history, and he arrived at a conclusion that most people are not ready to hear. Suffering in the Jungian framework is not an error in the system. It is the system working at its deepest level. The psyche, Jung observed, is not interested in your comfort. It is interested in your wholeness. And wholeness requires the destruction of everything partial, everything false, everything that was assembled by fear or conditioning rather than by genuine inner life. This is not a comforting idea. It was never meant to be. But there is a difference, a vast and crucial difference, between suffering that is merely pain and suffering that is transformation, between the kind of destruction that ends things and the kind that begins them. Jung mapped this difference with extraordinary precision. He gave it names drawn from alchemy, from mythology, from the deepest architecture of the collective unconscious. And if you are willing to follow him into that darkness, not to find an easy exit, but to understand where you actually are, what you discover may change not just how you endure your suffering, but how you understand your entire life. These are the 7 reasons Carl Jung believed your greatest suffering was never a mistake. The first reason, because the psyche never wounds without purpose. Jung made a distinction that almost no one in modern psychology has been willing to preserve. He distinguished between the ego, the conscious identity, the self you know, the name you answer to, and the self, which he capitalized deliberately to mark it as something categorically different. The ego is what you have constructed across the years of your life. It is built from praise and punishment, from the expectations of your parents, from the social roles you learned to perform, from the image of yourself that others found acceptable and that you eventually began to find necessary. The self is not a construction, it is a ground. It is what Jung called the totality of the psyche, the whole of what you are, including all that you have repressed, denied, projected outward, and buried beneath the persona you present to the world. And here is what Jung observed with the precision of a man who spent decades watching the human soul. When the gap between the ego and the self becomes too wide, when the life you are living has drifted too far from the life your deepest nature requires, the psyche begins to generate symptoms. Not metaphorical symptoms, real ones. Anxiety that cannot be explained. Depression that visits despite every external reason for contentment. Relationships that collapse in patterns you cannot seem to escape. Dreams that carry a heaviness and urgency entirely unlike ordinary sleep. A feeling, quiet but persistent, that something essential is wrong, even when nothing obvious is broken. These symptoms are not malfunctions, they are communications. The psyche, unable to reach you through gentler means, begins to speak in the language of crisis. It breaks into your carefully managed life because it has been knocking quietly for years, and you have not heard it or have chosen not to. Jung wrote that neurosis, and he used the word broadly to encompass all forms of psychological suffering that have no simple external cause, is always a substitute for legitimate suffering, meaning the psyche will produce the suffering it requires you to undergo, one way or another. If you refuse the genuine transformation, it will find another route, a slower one, a more corrosive one. The pain you are in, if it has the quality of depth, if it feels not just difficult but somehow important, if it has the weight of something that has been building for years, is not arbitrary. It is the psyche insisting on a reckoning that was always coming. This is not punishment, it is precision. The second reason, because what breaks you was already broken. There is a particular cruelty in the way major suffering arrives. It so often targets what we loved most: the marriage, the career, the friendship, the sense of self, the belief in our own stability. And we interpret this targeting as further evidence of the malice of the universe, or the randomness of fate, or our own fundamental undeserving. Jung would have reframed the targeting entirely. What breaks in a genuine psychological crisis is not what was strong, it is what was hollow, not hollow in a moral sense, not weak or worthless, but hollow in the specific sense of having been constructed from the wrong materials, built from social expectation rather than genuine desire, from fear of abandonment rather than authentic love, from the need to be seen rather than the need to be real. Jung's concept of the persona is essential here. The persona, derived from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in classical theater, is the face we present to the world. It is not entirely false. It is a necessary adaptation, the social self that allows us to function in relationship and community. But when the persona becomes the whole of identity, when a person has lived so long as their role, their reputation, their performance of competence or goodness or strength, the psyche begins to register the falseness, not loudly, not immediately, but with the patience of deep water. It accumulates pressure, and then something cracks, a betrayal, a failure, an illness, a loss. Something from the external world lands with enough force to fracture the persona, and what feels like destruction is actually the first honest moment in years. Because behind the persona, Jung taught, is the shadow, all the emotion that was too intense to be acceptable, all the desire that was too dangerous to acknowledge, all the grief, the rage, the longing, the fear that was carefully filed away in the basement of the unconscious, because there was no room for it in the managed, presentable life above. When the persona breaks, the basement opens, and this is terrifying. This is the experience most people interpret as falling apart. But it is not falling apart, it is coming apart, which is a different thing entirely. Coming apart is what happens to something that was assembled from the wrong pieces, and it precedes the possibility of being assembled correctly for the first time from the right ones. The third reason, because darkness is not the opposite of the path, it is the path. Jung drew extensively from the tradition of alchemy, not the literal medieval attempt to turn base metals into gold, but the symbolic system that alchemy preserved in encoded form for centuries. He recognized in alchemical language a precise map of psychological transformation that the rational modern world had discarded, and that the psyche, apparently, had never stopped requiring. The alchemical process begins with a stage called the Nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution. In the original texts, the alchemists describe this stage in images of decay, death, and putrefaction. The prima materia, the raw material of transformation, had first to be broken down entirely, reduced to its most elemental state, stripped of all the forms it had previously inhabited. This was not considered a failure of the process. It was considered the beginning of it. Jung translated this directly into psychological experience. The Nigredo is what you are living when your life has lost its form, when you cannot summon the motivation that used to come easily, when the person you were seems like a stranger, or worse, like a fraud, when the darkness is not occasional but constant, not a passing mood but a season, long, moonless, and cold. Most modern psychology attempts to end the Nigredo as quickly as possible, to medicate it, manage it, reframe it into something less uncomfortable. And there are absolutely contexts in which intervention is necessary and right. But Jung held a deeper view. The Nigredo, when it is the genuine article, when it is the psyche undergoing true dissolution rather than mere circumstantial grief, is not a condition to be cured. It is a threshold to be crossed, because on the other side of the Nigredo, the alchemists described the albedo, the whitening, the first emergence of clarity from the darkness. Not the full light of completed transformation, but the first intimation that something new is finding its form. And beyond that, after work that Jung never described as easy or quick, the rubedo, the reddening, the full embodiment of the transformed self. The gold that was always potential in the base material, but could only be reached by going through the fire. The suffering that feels like it is ending. You may be the blackening before the whitening. You cannot know this for certain. You can only know that the darkness itself is not evidence that the process has failed. Sometimes it is evidence that it has finally, truly begun. The fourth reason, because what you are losing was never really yours. There is a concept in Jungian psychology that carries more weight than its simple description suggests. Enantiodromia. Jung borrowed the term from the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who observed that all things eventually turn into their opposites. In psychological terms, any attitude, value, or way of being pursued to its extremes will eventually generate its own reversal. The person who has lived entirely for control will be brought to surrender. The one who has given everything to others will one day face the devastation of their own emptiness. The achiever who built their identity entirely on performance will encounter sooner or later the collapse that no performance can survive. This is not tragedy. This is the psyche correcting an imbalance. Jung observed that most people build their conscious identity, their values, their priorities, their sense of self, by developing certain capacities intensely while leaving others entirely unexamined. The man who cultivates only rationality and suppresses feeling. The woman who gives everything to relationship and abandons ambition. The person who constructs their entire life around strength and refuses the knowledge of their own vulnerability. This one-sidedness is not a character flaw. It is a developmental necessity. We become who we are by emphasizing certain things. But the psyche is not built for permanent imbalance, and when the imbalance reaches a critical degree, enantiodromia arrives. What was held with absolute conviction becomes suddenly untenable. The life that was built with total commitment begins to feel like a cage. The identity that seemed so solid reveals itself to be built on a set of suppressions that can no longer hold. And everything you lose in this moment, the certainty, the direction, the sense of who you are and what you are for, was never the whole of you. It was a selection, a necessary but partial construction. The loss is real. Do not minimize it. Years of effort and identity do not dissolve without genuine grief. But what Jung would have you understand is this: the thing being lost was already limiting you in ways you could not see because you were inside it. The enantiodromia is not taking your life, it is expanding it, painfully, radically, without asking your permission, toward the wholeness it has always been moving toward. The fifth reason: because your wound is also your calling. Among the mythological figures that Jung and his followers drew upon to illuminate the structure of psychological transformation, none carries a more precise relevance to the question of suffering and purpose than Chiron. Chiron was the centaur of Greek mythology, half human, half horse, who was renowned as the great healer, teacher, and wisdom keeper of his age. He trained Achilles. He guided Asclepius, the god of medicine himself. He was called the wounded healer because Chiron carried a wound that would not close. He had been struck by a poisoned arrow, accidentally by one of his own students, and the wound was incurable. Chiron, who could heal others, could not heal himself. He lived with perpetual pain, and it was precisely this wound, this unremedied, unresolved suffering at the center of his existence, that gave him his particular genius for understanding the suffering of others. Jung saw in this myth a profound truth about the relationship between personal wounding and genuine vocation. He observed that the most effective healers, the most authentic guides through darkness, were almost invariably those who had not been spared the darkness themselves, not those who had healed from it cleanly and completely, packaging their recovery into a neat trajectory, but those who still carried it, who had learned to live with it, to move through it, to function with its weight, and had developed, in the process of that difficult coexistence, an understanding of human suffering that no theoretical training could produce. This is the archetype of the wounded healer, and it lives not only in therapists and doctors, it lives in anyone whose suffering has deepened them to the point where they can hold space for the suffering of others in a way that the unwounded cannot. If you have been through something that permanently altered you, something that you cannot simply recover from, something that changed the very composition of who you are, Jung would not ask you to return to who you were before. He would ask you to consider what that wound has made possible in you that was not possible before. Not to romanticize suffering, not to pretend it is a gift in the ordinary sense of the word, but to recognize that the wound and the gift are sometimes the same thing. That the very place where you were broken open is sometimes the place where something essential entered. The sixth reason: because the self is always moving toward wholeness, even through catastrophe. At the center of Jung's entire psychological system, the concept that everything else orbits is what he called the process of individuation. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is not the optimization of the ego, the refinement of the persona, the achievement of a more successful or more likable version of the person you already are. Individuation is the gradual, lifelong, often painful movement toward becoming who you actually are. The full person rather than the partial one. The integrated whole rather than the carefully maintained fragment. And Jung was explicit about this. Individuation does not happen in conditions of comfort. It happens in conditions of necessity. The psyche does not invite voluntary transformation. It imposes forced transformation through the experiences that crack the ego open wide enough for the self to be seen. The self in Jungian psychology is not a static entity, it is a dynamic center, the organizing intelligence of the total psyche, and it has a direction, a telos, to use the Greek term, an inherent orientation toward wholeness, toward integration, toward the realization of what the individual actually carries as their deepest potential. Most people live the first half of life building a self in the service of external goals, achievement, relationship, social belonging, security. This is developmentally appropriate. It is the necessary work of constructing a viable ego. But at some point, often in midlife, though it can arrive earlier or later, the self begins to assert priorities that the ego did not choose and does not welcome. The outer life, so carefully built, begins to feel insufficient. The achievements ring hollow. The roles feel constraining. The questions that were successfully avoided in the first half of life return. Louder, more insistent, impossible to outrun. This is not a crisis of failure. It is a crisis of growth. It is the psyche demanding that the second half of life be lived differently than the first, more inwardly, more authentically, with more attention to what actually matters rather than what is measurable. And the suffering that accompanies this demand, which can be considerable, is the friction between the ego's resistance and the self's insistence. The ego clings to what it built. The self requires what was never built. The suffering is not an obstacle to the individuation process. It is the individuation process. It is what transformation feels like from the inside before you can see what is being transformed into. The seventh reason. Because the unconscious speaks most clearly in the language of crisis. Jung spent his entire professional life demonstrating one thing above all others. The unconscious is not a passive repository of forgotten experience. It is an active, purposeful, communicating intelligence, and it has things to say to you that your conscious mind has refused to hear. It speaks in dreams. It speaks in symptoms. It speaks in the patterns of your relationships, the same losses, the same betrayals, the same inexplicable attractions that repeat across decades regardless of your conscious intentions. It speaks in the sudden, irrational certainties that arrive without explanation and carry more weight than any reasoned conclusion. It speaks most powerfully of all, the moments when ordinary life is shattered and all the protective layers of routine and role and rational management are stripped away. In those moments of radical exposure, when there is no persona left to maintain, when the ego has been too depleted to keep its defenses operational, when the suffering has brought you to a place of absolute stillness, the unconscious has direct access. And what it offers in that access is not comfort, it is truth. Jung worked with dreams throughout his life as the primary language of this truth. He understood that dreams do not repeat the concerns of the conscious mind. They correct them. They show you not what you already think, but what you have been refusing to think. They present, in images of startling specificity and emotional intensity, exactly the material that the waking life has been systematically avoiding. And in periods of major crisis, in the Nigredo, in the midst of enantiodromia, in the disorientation of the individuation process pressing hard against a resistant ego, the dreams intensify. They become more vivid, more architecturally complex, more insistent, as if the unconscious recognizes that the defenses are lowered and chooses this moment of vulnerability to deliver what it has been carrying for years. This is not coincidence. It is the intelligence of the psyche maximizing its access. What you receive in your most broken moments, this strange clarity, the images that arrive at 3 a.m. with more authority than any waking thought, the sudden knowledge of what must change that comes from somewhere below rational consideration. This is not the distortion of a destabilized mind. This is the unconscious finally heard. The crisis created the conditions for hearing it. That is, the seventh reason your suffering was never a mistake, because it opened the frequency, because the noise that was keeping you from your own deepest intelligence was finally quiet enough for the signal to come through. This is where the map ends and where the territory begins. 7 reasons, not consolations, not explanations designed to make the pain feel smaller than it is, but a framework drawn from one of the most rigorous and compassionate minds that ever tried to understand the human soul, for understanding what kind of process you are actually inside. You are not simply suffering, you are being restructured. The persona that was too small to hold who you actually are, it is dissolving. The life that was built to satisfy the wrong hungers, it is being revised from the inside by the only intelligence that knows what revision is actually required. The wound that you carry, it is not evidence of your failure. It is the mark of your initiation. Jung wrote, in words that have outlasted every easier thing ever said about human suffering, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Not some pain, not moderate discomfort. Pain, the kind that changes you permanently. The kind you do not get over, but get through. The kind that, if you are willing to carry it with awareness rather than simply endure it with numbness, will eventually, not quickly, not painlessly, but eventually, reveal what it was always carrying inside it. A you that is larger than the one who began this journey. A you that is no longer assembled from fear and performance and the need for approval. A you that carries your wound not as a secret shame, but as the specific instrument through which you're made capable of understanding what others are still too defended to understand. This is what the darkness was for. Not to end you, not to punish you, not to prove that the universe is indifferent and cruel, and that your trust was foolish, but to break open the particular version of yourself that was too small, and to create the conditions in which the larger version could finally, at considerable cost, begin to emerge. You are not lost in the dark. You are in the alchemical vessel. The fire is not your enemy. The fire is the process. If something in this video landed in a place that recognition lives, not intellectual agreement, but the deeper kind of knowing that arrives in the chest before it arrives in the mind, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe, stay with the work, not because it gets easier, but because understanding what you are inside changes everything about how you move through it. The next video continues this journey into what emerges on the other side of the Nigredo, into what Jung called the albedo, the first light after the long darkness, and the specific signs that your transformation is not ending you, but completing the first stage of something that has no name yet, but is already beginning to take form. That video is coming, and you will want to be there for it. Like this if it found you. Subscribe if you intend to stay, and until next time, go deeper.